I'm sorry, everyone. So, hello, everyone. Good morning to those who are joining us today. Welcome to all school students, teachers, parents from all around Malaysia. Not forgetting all UMS students and all UMS staff present in this session today. Thank you, and we meet again for today's session of UMS STEM speaker series. For those who join us for the first time, this STEM speaker series is a co-joint effort with the Institute of Tropical Biology and Conservation UMS. This program aims to provide an opportunity for schools or community students to meet and interact with role models in the STEM field virtually or face-to-face. The invited speakers are academics, subject matter experts who talk about their career path and motivate them to teach and venture into the STEM field. For our dear audience, if you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions on the chat box at the right side of this YouTube live session. And please be informed that for today's e-certificate will be given to school students and UMS students, but must be in the form through a QR code which will be shared at the end of the program today. So please stay tuned with us. For with us today is a distinguished academician, Dr. Evan Quah from the Institute of Tropical Biology and Conservation UMS. Dr. Evan Quah is a herpetologist who studies amphibians and reptiles in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. After graduating with his PhD from University of Science Malaysia in 2016, he continued on as a postdoctorate researcher at USM for 2 years. After that, he joined University Malaysia Terengganu as an associate professor before moving to Borneo to join University Malaysia Sabah. He has been involved in the field of herpetology for over a decade now, and his research interest is in the taxonomy, diversity, speciation, and phylogeography of herpetofauna in this region. In addition to conducting research in Malaysia, he has collaborated on research projects in neighboring countries, including Myanmar, Singapore, Cambodia, and China. Together with his team, they have discovered more than 50 species of amphibians and reptiles that were new to science around the region. He also obtained a number of international research grants from organizations such as the Nagao Natural Environment Foundation, National Geographic Society, and the one from the Save the Snakes organization. Dr. Quah also served as an associate editor for herpetology for the Raffles Bulletin of Zoology since 2016 and Zoo Taxa since 2019, and he has an invited reviewer for more than a dozen journals, including vertebrate zoology, zookeys, zoological research, and zoo systematics and evolution. He is also a Fulbright scholar, and in 2019, he was one of the recipients of the inaugural Tony Whiten Conservation Prize as recognition for his research and conservation work in karst ecosystem in Myanmar. So congratulations to you, Doctor. And for the audience, let us fill the chat box with some appropriate emojis. So without further ado.
Thank you very much, Norwasna.
Yes, so without further ado, please welcome Dr. Quah with his topic, the value of specimen in museum collections for humanity. Are you ready, Doctor? Please be involved.
Yes, I'm ready. Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Doctor. Good afternoon.
All right. So I can just proceed, right, Wasna?
Yes, you can.
All right. Okay, thank you very much once again for that wonderful introduction. So as has been stated, the topic of my talk this afternoon will be on the value of specimens in museum collections for humanity. So, hang on. Tunggu, kenapa tiba-tiba slide tu tak gerak? I apologize for the slight technical issues.
It's okay, Doctor. Take your time.
It was working just now when we tested it. Okay, all right, we are back online. Okay, so over the course of this hour, I will be covering, uh, some topics, which include a brief history of natural history collections, all right? And most importantly will be the importance of these natural history collections, especially the need for physical specimens, all right? And I will also be touching on the applications and benefits of these collections in research, as well as the future of natural history collections in museums, okay? So I would like my talk to be slightly more interactive. So if I could get some feedback from the audience along the way, that would be great. We try and keep it a bit more santai lah. That was my intention lah. So how many of you all here have actually been to natural history collections, or have you been to a museum that has natural history collections? Nobody. Wasna, pernah pergi?
Yes, doctor?
Okay, you've been to. Okay, so around the world, there are numerous natural history collections, that. Okay, tunggu, I'm trying to change the slide again. Yeah, so around the world, there are numerous natural history collections, that store a wide variety of different taxa, from invertebrates to vertebrates, plants, fungi, etc. Some examples would be the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in the US, or even the museums in Germany, such as Berlin. Okay? And here in Sabah, we also have some natural history collections. I'm not sure if some of the locals here are aware. One such place would be the Sabah State Museum within Kota Kinabalu itself. All right, I hope some of you have been there to visit, and brought your families there. There are some biological specimens kept there, including a skeleton of an Eden's whale. There are also mounds of the now extinct Sumatran rhinoceroses there in the museum, as well as other animals, that are put in pretty good dioramas as well. And it's not just at the Sabah State Museum that some natural history specimens are housed here in Sabah. Even in UMS, we have a number of collections as well. I hope some of the staff and the students are aware. One example would be the Aquarium and Marine Museum. I hope some of you have been there before. As the name suggests, they house mostly more marine organisms, obviously from the oceans that surround Sabah, which includes things like turtles, crustaceans. There's also a skeleton of a beaked whale, some shell collections. They also maintain a living collection, in the form of the aquariums there that house interesting species of fish and other invertebrates. However, I myself, as the moderator has introduced, I am based at ITBC, the Institute for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And over here as well, we have a collection, okay, which is known as the BORNEENSIS collection. And I'm going to share a little bit about the collection that we have here at our institute, okay? Have any of you been to this collection before? I hope you all have. If you guys come in to our office in the very front, you'll be greeted by a very beautifully mounted skeleton of a Bornean pygmy elephant, all right? And as you can see in my slide, that is the Borneensis Gallery. So the Borneensis Gallery was founded in 1995, and it serves as a reference collection for flora and fauna around Borneo, especially for the state of Sabah, okay? And we aim to be a resource for local and international researchers as well as students, okay? And one of our goals is to educate and raise awareness among Malaysian citizens about our natural history, especially Sabahans, to feel proud about the flora and fauna in your own state. Okay, moving on. Apologize, the loading of the slides might be a bit slow because some of the files are pretty big. Okay, so a little bit about the research collection. What you saw in my earlier slide, that was the gallery section that is open to the general public, for those who want to come and visit, learn a little bit about the animals and plants, found here in Borneo, especially Sabah. But we also have research collections, and we have 4 main research collections here in Borneensis. which compose of the insect collection, the wet collection, the vertebrate collection, and the herbarium. There are some other smaller collections, such as a collection for mollusks, snails and bivalves, as well as a few other smaller taxonomic groups. So here are some quick fun facts, of the number of specimens that we house in Borneensis, okay? For insects and mollusks, we have about 137,000 specimens and counting. For the vertebrates, we have over 6,000 specimens at the moment. For plants, we have over 7,000 specimens. And for fungi, we have about 1,150 specimens, okay? So by this point in time, you guys will probably be thinking, so what is the point of you all collecting all the specimens, What are they for? Well, there is a reason, for all this work that we put into collecting these specimens. Okay, so natural history collections are important because they are a physical record of biodiversity in the natural world, and every specimen that is collected from the field is unique, okay? You must remember that every specimen that we collect, represents a biological record, at a particular place and time that cannot be obtained or replicated again, okay? And then what these specimens, and collections provide is access to verifiable data, that can be reused by different researchers over time to validate research, or provide additional insights into our living world, okay? Okay, so for example, okay, take this pinned insect collection, from the Florida Museum, okay? So you look at all these hoverflies over here on the left. See, each and every one of these hoverflies, they may be the same species, but each of them are unique in their own way because they bear individual data, as I mentioned. For example, if you to pick up one of those, you would find on the tag, it was collected at a particular place, a particular time. No two specimens are unique, they may be of different sex, or bear other data, okay? So this is why each and every one of these specimens, is very important in their own right. So now, a quick history of natural history collections, and how they first formed, So natural history collections, began more as, curios, of the early Victorians, okay? So in the colonial era, when early explorers went out to explore unexplored places in the New World or the Old World, the collectors would then, hunt and collect different kinds of plants and animals that would then be shipped back, to early Victorian Europe, and the rich at that time would then pay to collect these specimens because they would almost become like trophies that they would showcase to guests, and they would, be of, certain value, for their own personal pride, And currently, it is estimated there are probably about 2 to 4 billion specimens, housed in collections worldwide. But in the past, all these collections were used mostly as reference material for taxonomists such as myself, to record biological diversity, or to describe new species. And in the last 2 centuries, these collections were very essential, because, early explorers were still, learning about all the new diversity that they had found, when they explored different regions of the world. These collections were also very instrumental, they inspired the thinking of famous early naturalists like Darwin and Wallace, through the specimens that they had collected or examined on their voyages. However, in this day and age, natural history collections are still as relevant as they were before, and they are not something of the past, and I will speak about why they are still very important in this day and age. So this is an illustration of what, an early natural history cabinet would have looked like during the Victorian era, okay? It would just be a sort of, jigsaw puzzle of all different groups that the collectors, or the rich, would have bought and then displayed in their houses. They probably wouldn't be just, plants and animals. They may even be tribal art, and such, okay? And over time, this has evolved, into a more organized form, such as some of the earliest museums like the Natural History Museum in the UK, in this image taken in 1924, where they already had properly taxidermied museums housed inside glass casings, as well as in the main atrium for the general public. So as I mentioned, okay, all these early collections were very important, for traditional taxonomic studies because it encompassed, specimens that were needed for reference material to describe and classify biodiversity, and the work was based off living, preserved, or even fossilized material. So as you can see, there's been a very long history of collecting, over the centuries, and fossils especially, extends our records of Earth's biota for more than 3.4 billion years. However, natural history museums have come a very long way, okay? They're not these dry, dusty, old, boring collections like what people think of as museums nowadays. Take, for example, the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum in Singapore, that was launched, in a couple of years back. Not only do they house, modern exhibits, they even have living exhibitions. For example, the outer facade of the very building was built such that they can display, the native vegetation that is found on the island, so visitors are able to walk there, and then learn about some of the flora that grows, in coastal forested areas in Singapore. And using modern technology as well, natural history museums, are able to improve the dissemination of knowledge through the use of things like augmented reality, such as using iPads, visitors, especially kids, are able to walk up, for example, to a dinosaur skeleton. You can scan a QR code and then there's an animation that tells you about the species, its natural history. They are even able to move the animal through animation. So yes, natural history museums have come a very, very long way. Another example, which I'm going to show, for example, a couple of years back, again at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum, they had an exhibit on flora and fauna found on Christmas Island. So using computer projections, they projected onto the floor, images, of the Christmas Island red crabs, to give an idea to visitors of the sheer number and the magnitude of the crab migrations whenever they move to the sea every year to spawn, So it was also very interactive for kids, because kids are able to then play around in that area and then stomp on those crabs and see like how many they could stamp, in a particular number of time. Another example was a Gyotaku workshop that was also held at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum for kids, For those who do not know what Gyotaku is a traditional Japanese art form of fish printing, where in the past, before the invention of cameras and smartphones, that would be how fishermen would record, some of the catches that they found, where they would then paint the fish, with harmless ink, and then they would print it onto rice paper, and that would then be a record, of a particularly interesting or large catch, perhaps, so that people cannot claim that, okay, I caught a fish, that was 7 foot long when it was actually only 3 feet long, all right? So that was, in a way, the camera of the past, if you will. Nevertheless, despite all these advances, all right, physical specimens are still very, very crucial, okay? And there are many reasons for this, and I'm going to cover them. Okay, so first and foremost, it is impossible to collect certain data without physically examining specimens, okay? For instance, the measurements of certain morphological traits on the body would not be able to be, measured, or even recorded, without physically manipulating a specimen. And a mere photograph or an image of that specimen would not suffice, Specimens are also important for other more in-depth research such as DNA for molecular studies, stable isotope studies, of plant and animal tissue, even to find out, the nutritional content or heavy metal content in specimens, you will still need physical specimens for that. For example, researchers who are studying plant-animal interactions, pollinators, for example, if you were to take, again, I'm going to go back to the example of the pin bee or the hoverfly earlier on. So by picking up that pin insect, and carefully examining it under a microscope, for instance, you might be able to pick up, pollen that has been trapped on the body hairs of the bee or the insect, for instance, and then by determining what species of plant, or the flowers that pollen belong to, you'll be then able to infer, okay, what species of plants that particular bee was pollinating, and what particular date and time that was occurring at. So you can get a lot of additional information from physical specimens, okay? And this will include research into diseases and physiological processes as well. All right, so first, I'm giving examples from my own work right now, okay? I'm a taxonomist, so for me it is very important to examine physical specimens, especially if you're working with cryptic taxa, okay? So cryptic taxa are species that look very, very similar to each other, so it is very important for taxonomists, to be able to examine the specimens, to be able to carefully determine and key out the differences that we would use to delimit these different species, okay? So apart from this traditional taxonomic work, okay, there are diverse applications and benefits, to having biological collections for global change research, and I'm going to cover each of this very briefly to give you all an idea of, why they are very valuable. So in addition to taxonomy, collections are also valuable for gap filling of information, historical reconstructions, records of change through time, for conservation, agriculture, public health and safety, and it's also very important for enriching student education, and it also has got monetary value, okay? So first comes the gap filling. No one single expert, even the most senior and distinguished person on a particular subject or species, can claim to know everything that there is to know about a particular species of taxa. There will always be gaps in knowledge, no matter how much we have studied a particular group of animals. So having museum specimens helps us, fill in some of these gaps in knowledge, okay? And it's very important, for example, if you are conducting studies, tracking functionally significant traits, such as melanism or dullness of coloration, in a particular species, in relation, to the habitats they're utilizing. So for using these examples, for example, having a variety of pelts, from one particular species of rodent, you might be able to correlate, whether the darker specimens, might be occurring in perhaps, deeper forested areas with less light, as compared to, specimens, which are lighter colored, which could perhaps be utilizing habitats with brighter sunlight, for instance, all right? And then you also have specimens, within that range, that helps you fill in those gaps to answer some of those, hypotheses that you could be putting forward. Another example would be, again, from my own work, where we are able to use specimens in museums to fill in gaps in the knowledge of distributions of species as well as taxonomic confusion. For example, here in Borneo, at one point in time, all species of mahogany frogs, as illustrated in illustration A and C, were once thought to belong to one single species, okay? However, through careful work, and the examination of all the available specimens that we could, find in museums around the world, it was discovered that here in Borneo, in fact, there are two different species of mahogany frogs, okay? And although they usually occur in different areas, they sometimes do occur at the same area. And this would not have been possible, without being able to physically examine specimens, So right now, this is an example of how having biological specimens, we are able to refine our knowledge about the relationship as well as the distribution of particular species. Next would be the usage of specimens for historical reconstructions, okay? So present-day species and fossils refine our reconstruction of paleoclimates or even ancient ecosystems, and it helps improve our understanding of prehistoric fauna and flora. So are there any like Jurassic Park or Jurassic World fans here? I'm assuming and I'm hoping that there are. So I'm going to use, a very famous example, which would be the Spinosaurus, that was featured in the Jurassic World franchise. So when Spinosaurus was first discovered and described in 1915, it was thought, to be, at the time, like how the early naturalists would illustrate them, one of those lumbering lizards that would stand nearly upright on its hind legs, with the tail partially supporting the weight of the body. However, with the collection of new material from dig sites, it has helped refine what we know about this enigmatic species. For example, based off fossils that were discovered between the 1990s and the year 2000, paleontologists then knew that Spinosaurus, in fact, did not have the chunky skull that is typically associated with carnivores such as Tyrannosaurus, or Giganotosaurus, for instance. Spinosaurus had a very thin, elongated, crocodilian-like neck, and head that was more suited towards hunting of fish. And they also refined the posture of the animal, where the body was held in a more horizontal position, supported on its hind legs. Then, moving fast forward to the year 2014, newer were discovered, and once again, paleontologists refined, what Spinosaurus looked like. We now know that Spinosaurus had relatively smaller hind limbs, so the species was probably more quadrupedal, walking on all fours, as opposed to walking on its hind legs, And then based on the latest research that was just published in 2020, scientists now know that Spinosaurus lived a predominantly crocodilian-like lifestyle, mostly in or close to the water, based off new findings, illustrating that the tail of the species, was very flattened and paddle-like that could have been used for swimming, and even the discovery of fish remains, in the guts as well as embedded within the jaws of Spinosaurus. So we knew that they were actively fishing in rivers, and other large water bodies. Okay. So again, this illustrates, how having specimens in museums helps us to refine our knowledge, of species over time. So this is the example that I'm using based on the latest fossils that were discovered just, very recently and published upon. We now know that Spinosaurus, probably spent a lot of its time swimming in the water, based off, its tail structures and even some stable isotope studies, into its skeletal remains. And then we now know it was probably less of a land predator, unlike what people used to picture it as, like a T-Rex, hunting a Triceratops. But instead, it was probably a very active and, agile swimmer that was able to hunt, some of the large fish, such as prehistoric sawfish that shared its river habitats. All right. So next, biological specimens are also important records of change through time. Okay. Through these records, it would enable us to reconstruct, the human impacts, of global change in the past century. This is especially relevant right now. These can be through the documenting of plant and animal changes in morphology, and other observations such as the shift, of timing in life history, such as nesting, egg laying, flowering. We are also able to record species declines, habitat loss, or even the expansion of invasive species into new habitats. So, one example which I'm going to use is how having museum specimens enables us to document changes in morphology over time. Okay, and this can be indicative of shifting selection pressures. Okay, and they pretty much become, timestamps, that shows us that there has been evolutionary change, over the past decades or even centuries. For example, recent work, based off songbirds in North America has shown that climate change is causing these birds to shrink in size. All right, and this was only possible through the examination of specimens that were available that stretch back, centuries. Okay, so this is why it is important that we have, good, properly curated specimens in museums, because there's strength in numbers, with, more specimens to examine, with more records over time. We're able to conduct more robust statistical analyses, to support, some of the hypotheses, being put forward. Okay, and it's not only for morphology, all right. Physical specimens are also important for molecular studies, for inferring population changes, like I mentioned, all right. This can be through the sequencing of DNA for identification for some of those cryptic species, like I mentioned, or you could even be building a barcode of life database, or they could be used for genetic fingerprinting, which can provide records into population bottlenecks in the past, hybridization events, and etc. And this is especially important, for example, for species that have now become extinct in the modern age, such as the passenger pigeon from North America. Okay. Another example would be the Californian condor, a very enigmatic bird in the US. And through research, of fossilized specimens, ancient DNA has revealed that there has been substantial there was substantial genetic diversity prior to the population bottlenecks, due to extirpation in the last century from hunting as well as changes, in land management and such. Okay, another example I'm going to use, of research, based off museum specimens was on a group of woodpeckers in Sri Lanka. All right, there was once thought to be a wide-ranging species, showing variation. However, using a complementary set of both morphological data, from specimens that were housed in museums as well as genetic data, researchers were able to show that despite having a very narrow hybridization zone on the island, there were enough differences, in the two differently colored species, for the recognition and elevation of each to a specific species level. All right. Having museum specimens, it is also very important for phenological studies. So phenology is the study of periodic plant and animal life cycle stages, especially how they are influenced by climate. Okay, so everybody likes to throw the term climate change, climate change, climate change, but how do you quantify that? All right, so we need empirical data to make, claims about, observations that we think are happening. So long-term monitoring is one of the methods for deriving phenology data over time, and that would be through museum records that can span several decades or even centuries. Okay, and this will help us capture phenological variation over the years, and even climatic space, such as through temperature or precipitation changes. Okay, an example would be through the use of herbarium specimens, to help, in understanding global environmental change. For instance, living here in Sabah right now, when I ask people who have lived here all their life, they tell me, oh, usually, Evan, in the middle of the year, it should be very, very hot right now, right? It should be the dry season in Sabah. However, as you have noticed yourself, we are experiencing rain, as well as other climatic changes, of late. So if we as people are feeling it, definitely plants and animals in the environment are also reacting, to these changes in the environment. So perhaps plants could be flowering earlier in the year or later in the year. They could also probably be setting seed earlier or later. However, in order to quantify that, we would need to go back and check, specimens that have been collected, years and decades before, and then you can see, okay, for example, 20 years ago, a particular species of plant, started flowering in the month of March. However, now, at present, they only started flowering in the month of May or July. So with such data in hand, you can then be able to correlate it to the differences that we are seeing in precipitation or even other climatic factors, to make these correlations, to say that, it has affected the plants and animals in this day and age. Another benefit of having museum specimens, it is for conservation, all right? Museum records can help us infer the extinction risks of different plants and animals, and this would be through the extent of occurrence, area of occupancy, or even the fragmentation of an animal's range. Okay, taking for example, if I were to go through museum records, and then I find a very interesting record of a particular frog, for instance, that was reported to occur in a particular area in Kota Kinabalu that was collected in the early 19th century, okay? But then when I go back to that same location now, in hopes of finding that species again, instead they've put up a new shopping complex or a new mall. So effectively the habitat which once supported that species, has now been destroyed. So that species has now become effectively extinct from that location. So with such records, we can then find out, okay, where species used to occur and what their current range is. So we are able to refine, distribution maps of the species, for example, which would then help us, with conservation measures down the road. So using frogs again as another example, frogs being one of the most threatened groups of animals in the world, that has faced, detrimental loss, due to massive die-offs, through the chytrid fungus as well as other anthropogenic factors. We can use the data from historical collections, as I mentioned, to infer, what species are more at risk, or even find out, for example, okay, if a species was recorded from a particular location previously, all right, we might be able to mount expeditions to go back to that location to find out whether there have been any survivors after that mass die-off event, and hopefully we are able to rediscover some of these lost species, in coming years. And if we do, we should be able to then, have, more protection in place, to safeguard their future. So next, biological specimens in collections are also very important to humanity because they are very important to our food safety, all right? They're very important for agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most important industries, around the world, and crop pests cost farmers billions per year, all right? And again, I'm going to, refer to the latest Jurassic World movie. If anyone has watched it, knows, I mean, I don't mean to give out spoilers, but one of the plot lines would also be bioterrorism. So for example, introduce pest species, to an area where they are not native to would pose a very serious threat, to the local farmers and crops there. All right, so there are very, very strong implications, So having museum specimens, is very good reference material. For example, when a new record has been made, and then people would like to determine where that species came from or where the source of the invasion would have come from, we're able to go back and refer to museum collections for that reason. Whether they be through morphological comparison or even through sequencing and then comparison in a database, they would still all come back to biological collections in museums or other institutions. Also very important for agriculture would be the formation of seed banks, okay, for future food security, all right, especially in this day and age of climate change, all right. So examples of efforts being done right now would be the Millennium Seed Bank at Kew Gardens in the UK, where scientists, are trying to store, and maintain as much genetic diversity as possible for all the different plant species around the world, in case they go extinct, this would act as a safeguard, and these are also very important, especially for the crop species, as we know, whenever a particular monoculture is grown on a wide scale, they become very susceptible, to a particular disease, or pathogen that could easily wipe out the entire crop. So this is why it's very important to maintain genetic diversity of the different crop species through seed banks. This is one of the efforts that are being made. All right, next, something that will be very relevant to us, as we have all experienced in this last 2.5 years, all right? So biological collections, especially in museums, are very pertinent to public health and safety, all right? There will be records of pathogens, vectors of diseases, it would also be very, helpful, for future vaccine development, and there are also records of environmental contaminants, okay? So for example, taking COVID, like what we have, lived through, all right? We know that the source of most COVID viruses that have jumped the species barrier and infected people have been through bats, but there's often an intermediary host, such as, for SARS in 2002, it was, civet cats, for MERS, it was camels, For COVID, the debate is still out, but some hypotheses, have suggested pangolins, and other animals, all right? So knowing this, we would be able to infer when the next major outbreak might happen, through the examining, of, pathogens that might be stored within the bodies of museum specimens, through research. Another example would be museum specimens are very crucial in the study of comparison of emerging diseases, okay? For example, right now with global climate change, and a warming world, many species of tropical diseases are moving further and further north or further and further south from the equator, all right? So, for example, for vector-borne diseases that are spread by biting insects such as mosquitoes, knowing what species of mosquitoes occur in those areas before the particular disease reaches that location, it could be very helpful because you would then be able to determine, okay, what particular species of mosquito might possibly become the host vector for that disease. So mitigation measures can be put into place, in preparation for the disease's spread. All right. Biological specimens are also very important, in determining environmental pollutants, as I mentioned earlier on. One of the best, and classic examples would be the effects of DDT on the thinning of bird eggshells, okay? So DDT is that really toxic pesticide that has now been banned, that is accumulated to the food chain, through biomagnification, from prey species up to apex predators, all right? And this was first found, through the examination of eggshells, that were available in museums such as the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, that demonstrated that throughout the decades, as DDT use had increased, the eggshells of peregrine falcons, bald eagles, and other raptors had thinned tremendously, all right, due to biomagnification. So we human beings are also apex predators in the food chain, okay? So whatever is affecting other apex predators such as, ospreys and other raptors would also be affecting us inadvertently. So all right, so thus having museum specimens, they were very helpful in determining, these environmental pollutants that have affected our environment. So next, number 7, biological specimens are just fun to work with, and they're very enriching for student education, As a student, all right, do you not agree that you have learned better when you've gone on field trips, or expeditions where you have learned, through experiencing a particular thing yourself rather than just hearing the theory behind a particular subject, in a classroom? So yes, biological collections, in museums are very important to improve formal and informal learning experience. And as I said, it helps students, learn hands-on and to stimulate more interest, into scientific inquiry. And hopefully, it will inspire students to become scientists and we need more scientists, in the years to come. And finally, biological specimens have a monetary value as well, okay? By having by having collections in museums, it saves a lot of time and money, okay? As these biological libraries eliminates the need for costly, time-consuming, and even dangerous fieldwork, all right? So I'm going to speak, of this, from my own personal experience. And it also eliminates the wastefulness of duplication and redundancy of specimens. For example, if you already have a wide range of specimens of a particular species, in the collection, there would not be a need to go out and catch more of those specimens anymore, all right? And then it saves the scientific community millions of dollars, all right? And this is a saving that is transferred onto citizens whose taxpayers' dollars often support scientific research, okay? So the example I'm going to give is from my own. So for example, I used to do a lot of fieldwork in Myanmar. So a typical research trip to Myanmar for 2.5 to 3 weeks, would cost me approximately more than 6,000 ringgit. However, if those same specimens, or those taxa that I'm working with, were available in a museum in Singapore, for example, a flight down to Singapore, for me to work for 1 week at the Lee Kong Chian Museum would only cost me between 1.5 to 3K, which is less than half the amount, of what it would cost me to do fieldwork in Myanmar, all right, with also a lot less risk involved, okay? So as you can see, there is a monetary return, to having biological collections in museums. So before I end, we would definitely have to talk about the future of natural history collections in museums, all right? So in the past, a lot of the material just used to be housed in spirits such as ethanol, methanol, or even formalin. So there is now a need to curate, and catalog new material with modern technology, especially tissues for DNA work, that should be stored, in a cryogenic collection, for example, in a liquid nitrogen store, or even a negative AT freezer. And then next, specimens should also be digitized, so that there's greater access, okay? Because this would provide opportunities for collaborations, across disciplines and among other institutions, For example, researchers in developing countries in the tropics, such as us here in Sabah, or even in other parts of Southeast Asia, it's very hard to travel to bigger museums in Europe or the America to examine specimens. So having digitized material, it would help in our work tremendously. However, please note that this would still not completely negate the need to physically examine specimens under some circumstances. Okay. So, as I mentioned, in the past, many specimens were stored in spirits or formalin. For example, these are some snakes, frogs and other reptiles that were kept in spirits in the Natural History Museum of London. However, moving forward, more tissue, especially, such as muscle or even liver tissue, should be kept in cryogenic collections, such as freezers, in this example at the University of Kansas, or even at the Lee Kong Chian Museum of Singapore. And I said, all right, material, that is kept in the museum collections should be digitized, For example, here an ichthyologist, is digitizing some fish specimens at the Florida Museum, okay? So images, of incredible quality, that captures very fine details are possible in this day and age with the technology that we have, all right? So it is very helpful for taxonomists like myself. For example, we are able to look at, the images that are provided, and available to the public, and then we're able to compare it to material that we have in our own collections or in hand. So for example, again, going back to the example of the mahogany frog that I spoke on earlier on. So the syntypes, for one of the species is kept at a museum in Paris. And at that time, due to COVID, as well as financial reasons, I was not able to travel to that museum in order to examine those specimens. But thankfully, the curators of that museum had already started digitizing their collection. So images of their specimens were made available online, and I was able to determine some of the different characters which I used, in my own work, that then helped us for the group here in Borneo. Another example would be at the Lincoln University Entomology Research Collection right now. Not only have they started digitizing all their insect collections, every single specimen now even comes with a QR code, so you could easily scan that QR code and then you can find all the data that is associated with the individual specimen, all right? So this is the way forward, okay, for natural history collections around the world. So my take-home message, for my talk would be, nothing would ever replace taxonomic knowledge, and the training that museums provide. And unfortunately, many collections are now threatened by state and federal budget cuts, all right? So it's very saddening that, biodiversity collections, are not made a main priority by many of our governments, So I strongly believe that funding in this area should be a national priority, okay? And we need to train a new generation of scientists, and curators to manage and grow biological collections around the world. So with that, I thank you all for your time, okay? In case I'm not able to answer all the questions that you have, feel free to email me. I've put my email at the bottom over there. And before I would end, I would also like to welcome any of you all who've never visited our BORNEENSIS gallery or even our collection, to come and pay us a visit, all right? You can get more information from this poster or the QR code that I've included in this slide, or just feel free to drop an email to the curator of our BORNEENSIS collection, Miss Patrin Jimbao. Okay, so with that, I thank you all for your attention on this Friday afternoon, and then back to you, Nurwazna.
Thank you very much to Dr. Quah. It was a very interesting and wonderful topic and very well presented today, as well as the relevance of the specimens in museum collection. So we invite some questions to be answered by our guest speaker today that was sent to us during the presentation. Dr. Quah, actually I have my own questions for you.
Okay.
What is your opinion on ordinary people that collect the specimens for their own collection?
It depends on what the reason for the collection was, and of course, first and foremost, you should find out what the legalities of it would be, and then if it's permissible to have your own collection and you go to the legal means, then I'm okay with that, because I think, as I said, collections, are a very good way to introduce children, especially to the natural world. This is why, like, for example, I don't know about now, it's been very long since I was in high school, but then you formally in Form 6, or even in university, students would have to come up with an insect collection as part of certain courses, right, to pass. So yeah, that's almost like a first step, like dipping your toes into the pond, to introduce children, to collecting insects, to taxonomy work, the systematic work, Yeah, so I think it should be encouraged, for the right reasons. Or even some people like collecting seashells, and I think that's also a very good way to introduce, children especially to the natural world, and yeah, hopefully inspire more researchers to take interest in taxonomy and systematic work. Yeah.
Yes, I agree also. Let me first check if there is any questions from the audience. All right, that's will be the end of our webinar for today. We hope all of you enjoy the amazing and interesting presentation. Okay, so the link for registration and e-certificate is now being shared for the school students and UMS students. Please scan the QR code, fill in your details, and fill in the Google form. And please answer the simple feedback questionnaire. So all students will receive e-certificate and SDP points for UMS students only. So before that, I would like to conclude this webinar. So museum collections, objects, specimens, and archival and manuscript collections are important museum resource in their own right, as well as being valuable for the information they provide about process, events, and interaction among people and in the environment. And in my opinion, every specimen is an ultimate source of original evidence, not only for past and current investigations, but for future discoveries. Biological and geological collections are not just the source of data on the natural world, they are the real elements of the natural world. And the main purpose of museums is to preserve and to restore specimens, right, Doctor?
Yes, correct.
For educational institutions, so that those specimens may remain safely in their collection for future generations to learn from. There is no doubt that museum specimen DNA could be valuable material for understanding biodiversity conservation in the future. Indeed, increasing the use of museum specimens might provide a new perspective on conservation genetics. So
Yeah, correct. Mantap.
thank you again, Doctor, for giving us the new knowledge today and for answering
Most welcome. My pleasure. Yeah.
questions and also for the amazing presentation. Thank you to all the audience for your participation. We look forward to seeing you in the next STEM speaker series. And it was
Thank you everyone for your time.
Yes, it was a pleasure to have all of you with us. with this, we conclude this webinar, and thank you and see you again.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Welcome.